Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical that Europe and America lead the way. I think recently with Brexit and some of the fallout from Trump in terms of international relations, I think both Europe and America have been a little bit lost. The bridge has been a little bit wobbly, and so we really need events like this to ensure we keep that dialogue, and also what has in historic terms been a force for progressive good, that is Europe and America, keep that going forward. So this is a great opportunity, especially at a time when Silicon Valley is reshaping the whole world. Look, I think Brexit is a negative, hugely regressive step for all concerned and for everything concerned, including a single digital market, especially because Britain has made such incredible advances in terms of the digital economy, in terms of having the country with the most online trading, for example. Now, Britain, in my view, loses out hugely by leaving the European Union. That's obvious. But I think equally the European Union loses out by losing Britain. Not that it was Europe's choice. But why did it happen? And I say this as someone who worked in the European institutions for 5 years. It happened because Brussels became remote, was perceived as being remote, and was perceived as benefiting some groups and not others, and was perceived as being an elite. And, you know, what a successful diversity policy does, for example, is really make concerted attempts to reach those people that feel socially excluded. That's why people talk about D&I. It's not just diversity for its own sake. It has to be diversity and inclusion. You don't just get some women and add them into a tech company. You have to include them and allow them to thrive. Otherwise, they'll leave, as they do and as they have. So I think you need to bring the elements together, which is about tackling exclusion, and we can talk about that in broad political terms, or specifically the digital economy, which I hope this conference will contribute towards progress there. But in general, as a British person, I just look forward to the day when Britain will bring all of its benefits that it has from being such advanced. I mean, beyond America. I mean, Britain is much better in terms of digital transactions, online transactions, banking. Online banking is much better in Britain than America. I couldn't believe when I came here I had to go back to using a checkbook. It was like I got, a stone tablet out. It was like, what? I just moved to Silicon Valley and I have to go backwards? I mean, it's strange. So Britain and the EU can have a really positive impact, and I just hope that Britain will realise how foolish the decision was to leave the EU and return as soon as possible. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, that this gender issue around gender inequality just goes on and on and on. And, men increasingly realise that it's not good for their sons and it's not good for their daughters, because it's born really of gender stereotypes, which either lock women out in the first place, or once they get in, as you point out, women are now ahead in terms of the degrees that they're getting and all the rest of it, but they still can't get ahead in terms of business. And often that's tied to caregiving responsibilities, which still disproportionately fall on women. And when I say disproportionately, I mean about 90% when it comes to kids. So that requires some of the legislation and help which we have in Europe, but we've seen it's not enough. And that's where I think, policy leaders need to intervene, which they have done in some areas, for instance, saying, well, you need a minimum number of women on boards, and you can't just have the one or the three, because you never reach a critical mass which actually changes the culture. And I felt that very powerfully myself when I was elected to the British Parliament in 1997. The Parliament the day before ours came in had been 90% men. When we were elected, because there were 101 Labour women got elected, because the Labour Party brought in rules about selecting women and said you must have a minimum number of women. I didn't, the seat I contested wasn't in that, but overall there were enough seats that did fall within those rules, because you don't want to exclude men. You do not want to exclude men. You just want to look at the facts and the data and say, oh, look, for the last 500 years, for example, effectively we've had a male-only shortlist. So look, we can't say women don't have the skills to be politicians or make policy. So we're going to ensure that there is a minimum requirement, because it's about representative democracy. The Greeks came up with that, and look, hey, actually our democracy is not representative, because it doesn't have, half the population is not represented at all fairly. So you need some of those rules, policy, rail guards to ensure certain underrepresented groups don't just fall off and in terms of representation. So you need that. And as I was saying, you need transparency and you need responsibility, accountability. And that means, companies and businesses need to have specific senior executives in the C-suite that have responsibility for getting these figures up. And that responsibility has to cascade down. Every manager in every department needs to be accountable for the diversity in their department. And there are certain things you can do, change in the hiring structure that will promote that. And then you need to change the culture of, you can get people in, but if it's a horrible sexist culture, say like Uber was, hopefully it will change, but Uber was like that, women don't stay. We saw that in Silicon Valley. So, you need some policy rail guards to help get the critical mass. That's how you change both the numbers and hearts and minds. Yeah, I think what Europe can learn from Silicon Valley is around its extraordinary capacity for innovation, for thinking about problems outside the box, for the compulsive desire to disrupt. But I think which often ends up in interesting technologies that benefit consumers, not always, but often. I think what Silicon Valley can learn from Europeans is that I think we've learnt to perhaps manage some of our diversity a bit better. I say that advisedly because, as I say, I can think of 1,000 examples where we haven't managed it. But I'll give you a practical example. So I come from the British broadcasting industry, and we've done something there that they would never consider doing in Silicon Valley. Well, I'm trying to persuade them to do it. But and what British broadcasting did, for example, was say, look, diversity is really important to us. And so what we are going to do is we are going to measure it, we are going to track it, we're going to build a software system that allows us to do that, and we're going to come up with industry-wide standards. Now, these were all companies that did this of their own volition. It wasn't about a government saying, oh, you must do this. Quite the contrary. It was the companies understanding that, we've seen the data shows that in any business case, diversity will improve your bottom line in terms of productivity. But what it shows in the creative industries is that you clearly get a greater creative product if you have more diversity of thought and diversity of background in the people there. And also, this is culture. You're broadcasting culture. You have a responsibility to represent everyone within a culture, not just a small example of the culture. And so, that example, which is called Project Diamond, is an amazing example, which in America, for instance, in Silicon Valley, they're like, you measured what? Oh, isn't that racial profiling? I'm like, no, it's not racial profiling. I know we don't have your background of, slavery, and it gets a bit tricky. I know there are issues here. We don't have the history in exactly the same way. We were all good at slavery, but what I mean is, we don't have that sensitivity in quite the same way, because slavery wasn't actually really on our shores. It was a business deal that we transacted. We don't have any less culpability. But the point is, we are able to move forward in a way that marries collaboration with technology, with industry-wide diversity guidelines that the businesses themselves have come up with and are pushing forward. And that is a brilliant example that I hope Silicon Valley will follow.